There's hardly ever a slow day in Ukrainian politics, but even by Ukrainian standards, 2017 was saturated with reform efforts, corruption, international diplomacy, and in the end, Mikheil Saakashvili. What were the key issues and what are the most important takeaways? We are joined in the studio by the journalist, a correspondent for France 24, Gulliver Craig, who is based in Kiev and spent a lot of time here, and Katerina Smagli, who is the director of the Canon Institute in Ukraine. Thank you for joining us tonight. But before we go for the question, we reflect today's news and would introduce it to our audience. So clashes have erupted in central Kiev after several thousand protesters demonstrated today to call for the impeachment of President Petro Poroshenko. The protesters who were taking part in the march for impeachment, organized by former Georgian president and Odessa regional governor Mikheil Saakashvili, clashed with the police while trying to seize the October Palace concert hall where jazz performance was taking place. Saakashvili later attempted to steer his followers away from the concert hall and redirected them to the Ukrainian parliament. In a press statement later, the police accused participants of throwing firecrackers, attempting to break into the palace and damaging the building doors. Police also claimed that the law enforcement officers suffered poisoning from the unknown substance. Already the reformers, former allies of Saakashvili, condemned these kind of events. We'll talk about the general takeaway from 2017, but we're ending up with this one happening. So I would be eager, maybe Katya starts with you, what it all means for the whole year and for the next year.
Well, we certainly see that Saakashvili's star is rising, that the number of his supporters is constantly growing, that the peaceful protest that they started, the rally that they held last Sunday, was less in numbers than compared to today's rally. And to my personal opinion, what happened today at the Zhavnevi Palace was clearly a provocation, which was staged probably by the authorities, the people in the Ukraine's law enforcement services, which wanted to present Saakashvili and his supporters as rioters, as provocateurs, as people who do not want to conduct a peaceful protest, but who will probably make situation in Ukraine a little bit more chaotic.
To remind to our audience, the Saakashvili had been arrested last week, a week before, and later released by the court. He's accused by the government on cooperation and getting the funds from the former Yanukovych ally and maybe staging the protest. But Gulliver, we will talk about the whole political year in Ukraine, but what this particular story of Saakashvili, how do you see that and what do you think it means?
This particular events of today, whether it's a provocation...
I would also speak about the events today and the Saakashvili, the whole thing.
Yeah, what I mean is I'm not really sure to whose advantage it is if there are events like clashes today between protesters and police, whether it attracts more attention for Saakashvili, who is clearly desperate to be in the news all the time, or whether or not it portrays his supporters as being violent and dangerous. So maybe you're right that it's a provocation, but it could be the other way around. It could be that Saakashvili wants to attract attention. And I think all the way through the sort of his campaign that he's been doing recently, he talks a lot of sense. He channels a lot of anger that I think a lot of Ukrainians must feel at the situation in the country. But at the same time, he also has very irresponsible rhetoric, I think, a lot of the time. The rally, I didn't see him speak today, but 2 weeks ago when I saw him speak, he starts saying, we know where these people live, these corrupt elites in Koncha-Zaspa, in the other suburbs of Kiev where they have their mansions. It really sounds like as if he's almost encouraging people to go on sort of lynching missions to these people's houses and to turn towards violence. He always stops short of really calling for violence, but he's sailing very, very close to the wind, and I think he's being quite irresponsible.
So coming up to the year 2017, and again, we'll go to the political kind of campaigning for the president election 2019. But what do you think were the most important things? If we speak about the president, the reforms, the relations between the anti-corruption institutions and their role, as well the international partners and the war. We'll have a separate questions, but maybe you will say what are the most important.
You want to start with me? Yeah, so you know, Bob Dylan, the Nobel Prize winner in literature this year, he has a very famous song titled "The Times They're Changing." So for Ukraine, the times they're also changing. So we witnessed a very good start with the reforms immediately after the Orange Revolution, and this year, I think, became the turning point both for Ukraine's civil society and for the president, when the two parties clearly realized that you should either go very aggressively with pursuing the reform agenda or stop pretending, actually, that you are in the reform, still in the reform process. And all the very recent events of the November and December, they clearly demonstrate that the presidential administration has crossed the line where it started very openly, without any limitation whatsoever, go after civil society activists, especially those who pursue the anti-corruption rhetoric and who actively and aggressively push this government for the reforms. The situation with anti-corruption agencies, the recent appointment of the new Supreme Court judges, where we have almost 30% of the judges representing the old regime, the total ignorance of this administration of the demands put by the civil society, they demonstrate that the president is consolidating his power, and he is trying to win the next elections not by his dialogue with the civil society, but just the opposite, by using the power vertical, which he had very actively been building over the last 3 years, and that would be his way to demonstrate that, you know, it is much easier in Ukraine nowadays to win elections based on power vertical rather than pursuing the promises which had been given at the Maidan.
If we look back to 2014, if you were talking to somebody who was arguing in favor of electing Petro Poroshenko as a president, the key argument was Ukraine needs somebody from the inside, who has his connections, who's from this world, because only somebody from the inside can change things for the better. So we need somebody who's from that world but wants to change it, wants to reduce corruption, and that was what people who believed in Petro Poroshenko, that's the reason they thought he was the man for the job. And I think 2017 has really been the year when we finally saw that either he never wanted really to change it or he has failed to do that, because the last few months, what we've seen in terms of the actions against the Anti-Corruption Bureau really don't leave any more room for illusion that he's seriously interested in change.
I would like to ask the polls, especially just to, again, remind to the audience that we'll have the presidential election in 1 month, 1 year, 3 months, March 2019, which is pretty close. So we're expecting to get into the campaign already the early 2018, and as well the parliament election autumn 2019. So that's what we have. This is it's one of the polls, of course, by the Center for Social and Marketing Research Sources. So you see the President Poroshenko, who is have the 16%. Yulia Tymoshenko, an opposition leader, has her 14. Then, unexpectedly, what's interesting, this time it was included Sviatoslav Vakarchuk, the Ukrainian singer, but also Vakarchuk. He has never said he would run for president, but he is, there is trust to him, and as well, he participated in Euromaidan.
This is the argument that you need somebody from the inside to change the system still applies. This is the whole problem Ukraine faces now. It's still true. If Sviatoslav Vakarchuk, coming from outside the whole oligarchic system, despite his huge fame and his huge popularity, even if he were to run for president, wouldn't he just be crushed by, he hasn't got the people around him that is needed?
And secondly, he doesn't have a political party. We already seen this before. We already saw a boxer who was a very promising politician at the Maidan and who became a mayor. But at least the boxer, he had a party behind him, a pseudo party, Udar, right? But with Vakarchuk, this is, in my opinion, a very premature desire of political not experts, but political image makers, who try to fill the niche for a new leader, the niche that certainly exists, the niche which for various reasons cannot be filled by Euro-optimists, civil society activists. So they put him into this niche. Yes, he might be seen as a moral and ethical leader of the nation, but still, Vakarchuk doesn't have a political experience. He doesn't have a party, which helped him to propel into politics. And secondly, I don't think he even has a program, which can be seriously discussed.
He just released a video in which he states very clearly that he doesn't want to run for president. He insists on that again, but he also lists 10 points of key things that he thinks need to change in Ukraine, and says he's ready to throw his weight behind any politician who's willing to realize those 10 points. And interestingly, he says in the video, it doesn't matter if that politician's surname ends in Ko, typical Ukrainian ending for a surname. And that made me wonder, is that because he's thinking about throwing his weight behind Saakashvili? Because why otherwise would he sort of insist on the fact that it doesn't matter if someone's Ukrainian?
Just generally add to the discussion what we know that he hasn't taken the decision, but this idea had been considering. So maybe later, I mean, there is still a time, and there always could be the surprises. In Ukraine, there are usually the older people who've been already in the politics. I'll add that there is the one of the members of the opposition bloc, Yuri Boyko, with 9%, and Anatoly Hrytsenko, who is not that known.
He always does so well in polls, and no one ever talks about him.
He's a former Minister of Defense and the leader of one party, very critical to the president, and as well from this kind of a bit of the person, an honest person. So my question would be, can you would also explain how was this year for other politicians? You think that nobody had grown. You don't see a really opponent, and in the government, in the Narodny Front, you don't see, for instance, Arseniy Yatsenyuk or the others there. And also, what we could expect do you think, and where would you look, for instance, in the next year, knowing that the opposition bloc is still there? And Yulia Tymoshenko is still running around the villages, and not just the villages.
Look at this situation. We're in an election potentially in early 2019 where you're going to be able to get to the second round with just 14%. If it stays like that, you really don't need to be very popular to be in with a strong chance of becoming president of Ukraine. It's quite extraordinary.
And if we speak about the war, that's where I would like to go. We have seen a bit of the progress after the Kurt Volker had been introduced as the envoy, because the war before there was a stalemate. Now there are still the talks about the peacekeepers, so we don't know how probable. But to your idea, to what extent the war is a factor, and what factor it is? Is it like the something which is used in the political rhetoric, or do you see the political forces and the real in future, or somebody who is really doing a lot in order to solve the conflict, in order to kind of make the people who are suffering from the conflict live better?
Well, in my personal view, President Poroshenko is exploiting the war and is exploiting the patriotic feelings of Ukrainians to boost his own popularity. Many politicians all over the world, they use this phenomena, which is called the rally around the flag, where you make your population, make your citizens fight against the enemy, be it the real enemy or the imagined enemy. In Ukraine's case, of course, the enemy is very real, but unfortunately, instead of demonstrating very clear steps of how this conflict can be resolved, what kind of compromises can you allow yourself in order to stop the daily casualties that Ukrainian army is still suffering, President Poroshenko is simply kind of putting the responsibility towards the resolution of this conflict on the other party. In our case, on the U.S. government and on Kurt Volker as the last hope of Ukraine in resolving this crisis.
Ukraine is in a very difficult position, though, with this war. I can't see a solution in sight that could be achieved by Ukraine changing its policy alone. To be fair, I mean, that's not to detract from what you're saying about how politicians are, as it were, using at the very least the war as an excuse. I mean, the one thing that you might hope to see Ukrainian politicians do would be to improve the situation for people living in the Ukrainian-controlled parts of Donbas, where, for example, a friend of mine just got back from Stanitsa Luganska, where you can cross from the Ukrainian-controlled part of Lugansk Oblast into the separatist-controlled part, and huge bribes, to take anything you need to take across the border, just to get across the border, just to get your pass in time. That's what people there are experiencing. They're experiencing much worse everyday corruption than what they experienced before Maidan, and that kind of thing doesn't give people faith in the Ukrainian state at all.
Exactly. The Transparency International has recently released its report on illegal trade with the ATO zone, which demonstrates that a lot of Ukraine's agencies are simply benefiting on the war, and this has to stop.
And my very brief, if I can ask you to be very brief on the Ukrainian relations with the Western partners, do they trust more? Do they still trust Ukraine? Are they supportive on what they are relying and what they are hoping? What is your general feeling, if you can be brief?
In my opinion, the West is pretty tired of Ukraine's leadership. The West still trusts the people of Ukraine, and they believe that, these are the people of Ukraine who should be supported on the course of democratic transformation. However, all the recent statements which we've seen in response to the NABU conflict, the IMF, the World Bank, the US State Department, the European delegation, the European Parliament, we see that all these international partners are unanimous, and they are very critical of the currently taken actions by the Ukraine's authorities.
Yes, I think everyone I know from Brussels and diplomats here in Kiev seem to be getting quite exasperated with the Ukrainian authorities. But there isn't an alternative in sight, is there? These are the people that they have to deal with, and they're obviously committed to still supporting Ukraine and dealing with them.
Thank you for this roundup. Thanks for explaining it all. We'll still, in the program, we'll talk about the economic roundup of the year.